you are in this nation or beyond. And wow, I'm really just kind of in awe of this brilliant film we had the pleasure of viewing just now. Really, it took us to the intersections of migration, religion, violence here in our nation, and even the bigger question of who is American, right? And who gets to decide who is American. I'm thinking now in regards to that opening cut of the film that talks about 60% of Muslims in the US are first generation immigrants. And what Lisa didn't share in my bio, though she sort of alluded to it, is that my family also immigrated from the Philippines. And in my work at USC, I actually work in terms of spiritual care for our DACA students. And so a lot in regards to immigration policies and what was impacting our Muslim colleagues really hits home for me and my work and for my family. And it was also really sweet to see the face of, what was it, the Indonesian part community in New York, and really putting a face to Asian Americans within the Muslim community here. So again, so much of the stories told in this film were resonating with me. And I know for our audience, a lot is probably the same for you. And so I look forward to gathering some of your questions and giving them to our panelists. But let's go ahead and get started. I'm going to provide I'll introduce you to our panelists. I'm going to ask each of them one question each, and then we'll start pulling questions from the audience, but feel free to start chatting in the chat function at the bottom of your bar. And we have plenty of time up until about 3 p.m. my time, since I'm in California. And yeah, please do feel free to post your questions there. So if you were with us at the top of the hour, you already heard about Adam Zucker, our filmmaker, but I'll just remind you that he is an independent filmmaker and award-winning editor, having cut dozens of feature documentaries on issues of social justice, civil rights, environmental concerns, American history, and many other subjects. I invite you to look into him and his other films, which are sure to entertain. Next up, of course, you'll recognize this face from the film, Dr. Debbie Almontaser. She is an internationally recognized award-winning educator, entrepreneur, speaker, and authority on cross-cultural understanding, and the author of Leading While Muslim. She's an influential community leader and the founder and CEO of Bridging Cultures. And I could continue reading this, but just know that she is board president of the Muslim Community Network. She sits on several boards in the education field, and you saw it demonstrated in the film. She's an organizer, she gets things done, and you probably know her from her leadership role in the historic Yemeni Bodega Strike Rally and the I Am a Muslim Too rally. Last but not least, we have Munir Sheikh here. He is Vice President of Operations and Academic Affairs at Bayan Islamic Graduate School. He has nearly 30 years of experience as a nonprofit executive, a program manager, and a public educator. He has a master's in Islamic studies from UCLA and several certificates from academic programs in Morocco, Egypt, Spain, and beyond. So thank you to all of you for being here. Really looking forward to our conversation. My first question, I think I'd like to direct to Dr. Debbie, since you are one of the main subjects of this film. So here we are, almost exactly 4 years later. It was Friday, January 27th, 2017, right? When that executive order was signed by Trump. It was one of his first acts in office. And as we learned, it banned foreign nationals from 7 predominantly Muslim countries. It suspended entry to the country for all Syrian refugees. And that was indefinitely. And it also prohibited any other refugees from coming into the country. Wow. These were some dark days. And so I guess I'm curious, because that was 2017. We're now in 2021. How is your community doing? and what form is your organizing taking now?
Thank you so much, Vanessa. First, I want to start by saying Salam alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Peace and greetings, my sisters and brothers. Thank you so much for inviting me to participate in this panel. I always joke with Adam that I'm his sidekick because I love the film, and I think it's just done an incredible job in humanizing the impact of the Muslim ban that basically inflicted so much pain and suffering to both people in my community, the Yemeni American community, and their family members at large, who are refugees in some places such as Djibouti, Egypt, Malaysia, India and Jordan and Egypt because of the war that continues to ravage Yemen. So people in my community have really felt this drastically. Here we are now, 4 years later. The Biden administration made a campaign promise that on day one, the ban would be repealed. The ban was repealed as he has promised. And there is a huge sigh of relief for my community and communities that have been targeted by the Muslim ban. Everybody's feeling a sense of relief and a sense of hope and renewal, but we are not exactly out of the woods yet. And I will share why we're not. Though the ban was repealed, what this means is anyone who has an open application or have just applied, they should not face any ban for entry, given that they have to go through their whole entire visa application proceedings. But what he did for those who've already suffered in the last 4 years due to the Muslim ban, he has asked the State Department to basically do a full-blown investigation of the entire situation and to provide a comprehensive report within 45 days that shows who the people were that were rejected and basically assess the whole entire situation and then provide, the community at large, the public, with a report from this investigation. So we are waiting, patiently to see what comes of it. But the positive aspect of all of this is that the repeal basically has said that anybody who's been denied should contact their consulate and ask them to reevaluate their case. So what we've done at the Yemeni American Merchants Association, which is the organization we founded out of the bodega strike, is we've contacted the several hundred cases that we have and told them, please contact the consulate and let them know to reevaluate your case. And so we're just waiting right now and praying that those people who've actually been directly impacted will get the rightful relief that they deserve.
Yeah, thank you for that. The work doesn't end with the end of a policy. There's still so much to do, and even beyond the standards we set of getting rid of Trump policies. So I think we'll circle back to that, but I'm going to go ahead and move forward with a question for you, Adam. When you introduced the film, you talked about taking a sober view of the realities of our government's policies, right? And that's exactly what you did. And you showed the very real impact it was having on these communities in New York. And I guess I appreciate this glimpse of the American Muslim, right, in New York, in these variety of communities, Indonesian, Bengali, Yemeni, Palestinian, really New York has it all. And so I'm wondering for you, what was it like to take on this subject matter and really go in depth with these communities? I'm wondering if there were new learnings gained for your work as a documentarian and whether you faced any unique challenges since you were really filming in real time. So tell us.
Thank you, and thank you all for being here. And if I can make a little plug, for those of you who aren't overly shy, if you can put your video on, it does make it much easier for me to speak to faces and not to black boxes, but I understand. So whatever you can do is all good. I try to make films about very different things. And part of the reason is it's very immersive, and I like reacting to things for the first time. The previous film I made was in Poland, and I shot it over 4 years, and in communities that I'm both closer to and further away from. That is, it was about young women in Poland who were raised Catholic, which is a fairly common story, and then discovering they were actually Jewish. I'm Jewish. I had an entry into that community. However, I speak very little Polish, probably more than anybody on the Zoom who wasn't born in Poland. But other than that, I'm pretty poor, and it was far away, obviously. And when all this started happening, when Trump was elected, and I really felt the need to kind of reach out to try to tell a story of which I didn't know much, and I'd be the first to admit that. The phrase I would use is an outsider. And I've been corrected. Now that the film is finished, and I've kind of partnered with some Muslim presenters and some entities that I really appreciate, who tell me, you know, we don't really like that word. You know, we think of you as an ally. An outsider implies a certain kind of distance. And I appreciate that. So I do feel like an ally. At the same time, I was outside the community, and I wouldn't be so presumptuous as to tell people stories that I don't know. And the process really was trying to understand what people were feeling. I mean, the assumption I made and that I heard was that after the election, that Islamophobia was taking a really ugly turn and people were feeling really threatened on the streets. But I didn't really know that, feel that personally without going out and meeting people. And it's a wonderful opportunity. Really, I call it a gift to get to spend time in other places. And this is all within my city. I'm a native New Yorker and a lifelong New Yorker. I've lived my entire life in New York, probably the most diverse city in America. And I've been to all these communities, but I hadn't necessarily stopped long enough to really get to know people. So to get to spend time in Bay Ridge and Ozone Park and Sunset Park in Jamaica was really rich and wonderful. And I found people extremely welcoming of me. I don't like painting with a broad stroke, but I heard many times, you know, people in the Muslim community saying it's kind of our responsibility for us to get to let other people know us better. Maybe we haven't done everything we could have, and they shouldn't have to, but you know, people can only be prejudiced or have misunderstandings about people they don't know. So I think there was people feeling a need to open up, perhaps ways more than they may have previously, and I was sort of a beneficiary of that. And I really spent a lot of time on the ground in those communities, not necessarily even filming, just getting acclimated, getting people acclimated to me, what have you. And at the same time, you know, the film is two different things. I'm really interested in people's stories, and there's that private, intimate life of individual lives that was going on. But simultaneously, there was this political public event that was happening, that is the Muslim ban and all other kinds of anti-immigrant legislation that was, you know, happening one after another, and who knew where this was going to go. And I was trying to tell both those stories at the same time, so that you would really understand people's lives and at the same time understood what was happening in the street, in the demonstrations, at the rallies. And probably storytelling wise, that was difficult to have both those components there at the same time, but it began to just present itself as to how to do that, how to have that really come to life. And, you know, people like Dr. Debbie, who is, she's not my sidekick, she's the lead here. I appreciate your saying that. Were really very helpful. A number of times I went to speak to Dr. Debbie before I kind of sort of twisted her arm into appearing on camera. And she was saying, here's the people you really need to speak to. Here's the people, you know, here's people in the countries that are being affected by this ban. And you really have to try to bring their story out. So when I say her telling me you have to, I appreciate that. I mean, she understood what I was trying to do, and she was trying to help guide that along in a way that was much more informed. And lastly, it was kind of difficult. People that were directly impacted by the ban, or immigrants, recent immigrants that were endangered or vulnerable, those are not easy communities with which to connect. And I wasn't always successful at getting people to feel comfortable talking to me, people who had a lot to risk, and I understand all that. But at the end of the day, I try to put all those stories out there in a cohesive form.
Well, thank you for that. And I really do honor the task it is to be able to be comfortable enough to put the camera on, but also your dedication to letting the community tell the story. Because so often when you're making a film or so forth, you have an idea of what you want it to be like, but here really you get it straight from the source. And so I think it was really well done the way you wove the many stories into one. All right, well, I'm gonna go ahead and move on to Munir. And as I was watching the film earlier, I started thinking back, you know, I was working at Stanford back in 2017 when Trump took office. I just remember how it directly impacted our students. And lawyers showed up at SFO, right? Lawyers showed up at LAX. We saw it at JFK. And I'm curious because Munir, you've been an educator for, you know, I don't even know how long, 20, 30 years, maybe more. And I'm wondering if you want to share some of your insights from your lived experience as an educator, but also how these policies really impacted your work in your communities.
Well, thank you so much, Vanessa. And it's a pleasure to be here with all of you. Assalamu alaikum.
Right.
Certainly, you know, at the time that the ban took place, we, Bayan, were based at the Claremont School of Theology. And, you know, like the Chicago Theological Seminary has a very diverse population of students from around the country of different backgrounds. And amongst our student body, both within Bayan, but campus-wide, we had students who were in the Dreamers. You know, they were concerned about the legislation around DACA and so forth. So there was definitely a lot of apprehension on campus at that time. We had much more frequent weekly gatherings in support of students and, you know, in terms of their emotional state and their mental health. So it was you know, an unexpected kind of wrinkle in the normal challenges that exist, you know, within graduate school context. People are feeling different stressors all the time, whether it's financial or academic or otherwise. So this was just an increased, you know, degree of anxiety that emerged at that time. And there was, you know, a good amount of mobilization as well. Students on the campus, campus-wide, representing all the different faith communities, you know, went out to LAX, similar to what we saw in the film with the protests at JFK. We had, you know, caravans going out to LAX and doing the same kind of thing, and you know, participating in marches in downtown Los Angeles and so forth. So, you know, I would say that the ban was a policy that's an aberration in some respects. I mean, obviously the impetus for the ban is alive and unwell, I would say. You know, those who supported the ban, those who brought the previous administration into power, you know, were gratified by that policy, but it's good to see that the Biden administration immediately took action and rescinded it and sort of brought us back to hopefully a more appropriate track moving forward. You know, America is described as approaching a majority-minority situation where, you know, the various minority communities together in the aggregate, you know, represent America more so than, you know, the white community. So that dynamic is playing out. I think, you know, the tapestry of America is multi-religious, multi-dimensional, multicultural. And I think most of us in this program recognize that, embrace that, and want to see that move forward. I think the film does a great job relative to some older documentary films that are out there going on 20, 30 years about Islam in America or Muslims in America. Most of the older ones tend to still kind of display Muslims as an outside object and, you know, kind of at arm's length. And I think this film does a good job of kind of providing a more intimate sense of what Muslims of diverse backgrounds are going through. Of course, the scope of the film couldn't accommodate the complete breadth of the American Muslim experience. You know, 30%, you mentioned the 60% first generation immigrants, but 30% of Muslims are African American who have, you know, a particular heritage and historical experience. And, you know, that's obviously worthy of attention as well. And, you know, hopefully Adam or his peers in the filmmaking world will give us more insight into that as well.
Thank you, Munir. So I wanted to remind our audience that if you'd like to ask a question to our panelists, you can do that in the chat function. And how you do that is if you look at the bottom of your Zoom screen, there should be a bar, and you have options to look at the participants and reactions. And there's also a chat function there. I think for some of you, it might show up at the top if you're in gallery view, but feel free to chat in there and also post your questions. And in the meantime, I think I'll pose a question to our panelists and you guys can decide who wants to answer. I think halfway through the film, Dr. Debbie, you were talking about how terrorism continues to be framed, like the image is of a Muslim, right? And yet, in our very recent history, of our US Capitol, we see white Christian nationalism rear its head, right? And yet, you know, white supremacy, evangelical Christians and so forth, all of this, we are not necessarily seeing the same calls for, you know, call out the fact that Christianity is at the core of this terrorist act, right? And so this isn't a question for you, Dr. Debbie, but it's just calling to mind that there continues to be this imagery. And so I guess I'm bringing it up because we have educators here on the panel. We're based at a seminary and a graduate school. And even you, Adam, as a filmmaker, you're an educator, right? And so I'm curious, how do we approach this going forward, right? Is it our job to continue to show Muslims in a positive light until people understand, you know, that there is a distance between one's faith, tradition, religion, and so forth, and acts of violence? Or is there something else? It's a big question that keeps coming up in our seminary audience, and I'm curious what any of you would say to this challenge.
Munir, would you like to go first? And then I'm happy to chime in.
I'm sorry, Vanessa, if you could just, you know, in one sentence recap the question, because, you know, I know there was a lot there, so I just want.
Yeah, I'm just saying that there continues to be this image of Muslims as terrorists that America likes to uphold in the media. And yet it's very clear that white Christian nationalism has imposed more violence in our nation in recent history.
Right, right. Yeah, I mean, you know, Islam has always been the foil for the West in general. I mean, historically in the medieval era, and then, you know, in terms of modern times in the nation states, you know, Muslim societies probably weren't that significant in the imagination of Americans until, you know, after World War II and into the 70s and 80s, when, yes, certain geopolitical developments took place. But at the same time, in America, you know, obviously since the time of its founding, there's been a strong streak of white supremacy and subjugation of the indigenous populations and subjugation of other groups. And so, you know, the American Nazi Party, or, you know, the America First movement from a century ago, the DNA of those movements continue to be present as an undercurrent in American society. And even though we've become more diverse as a society collectively, clearly those undercurrents have gained ground in recent years. And it's very alarming and very disconcerting now that we're in an era of kind of fake news and lack of ability to create a sort of consensus around truth. It's even more concerning because these kinds of echo chambers are metastasizing and growing. And so even though I mentioned that the particular policy was an aberration, the undercurrents are there. And, as we saw with the Capitol riots a few weeks ago and the storming of the Capitol, that's just kind of an indicator of what potentially is yet to come on the horizon. So we have to be more vigilant. We have to bring those who are fomenting that kind of violence to account so that people understand that there will be repercussions for challenging, not the state per se. I mean, obviously protesting is important, dissent is important, but to do so in a way that jeopardizes our very democracy or republic can't be allowed to stand. It's unfortunate that Christian nationalism is part and parcel of that effort. And it's very ironic, obviously, because it's a kind of projection onto Muslims that, Islam is violent, but any religious tradition can be made to conform to ideological desires that certain groups may have.
And to add to what Munir was talking about, I think one of the things for me, within the last 20 years, here we are, in the aftermath of September 11th, 20 years later, what we saw happen at the Capitol on January 6th and the way that it was framed in the beginning of the riots was really interesting. The use of the word terrorism or terrorist or anything of that sort was not even, it didn't even come up in any of the commentary that we were seeing in the news. However, if you looked on Twitter that day, there were a lot of commentators that actually began to use it immediately. And interestingly enough, were being targeted for calling it that. And the reason that they were targeted is because we have become so conditioned, conditioned to only use that term when it came to anything happening at the hands of people who identified as Muslim. And so the equation of Islam and Muslims with the word terrorism and terrorist has been really, really unfortunate. And I think what happened on January 6th, for some of these commentators who immediately were using the word terrorism, it was really very, it was uplifting. It was, exhilarating to see people really standing up and speaking up, because that's what exactly was really happening that day. The lives of congressional leaders were, in danger. The lives of the vice president that day was in danger. The number of people that were hurt, the fatalities that took place that day. And it was only days later when people started to process what had happened that day, to really understand that this was terrorism. And what's interesting, again, going back to the vernacular, anything that's happening, in the US has now become called as domestic. And that's fine, as long as we continue to have the word terrorist there, and as long as people, move away from always connecting it to, Islam, and making it really more about the action, right? The act, the horrible act, the more that we are able to start seeing, people for who they are and what they're doing, without equating it to a religious group. And so, that's my hope for us. And I really think what is imperative of us to do is to constantly push that dialogue and get people to see beyond these, lenses that have been created to condition how we think about, violence.
Thank you both. And I can see that even within the chat, our audience is speaking, it's really about white privilege and the ability for one violence to be spoken in certain terms without even going into the language of terrorism, right? And so I think you both really spoke to that. Well, perhaps my next question for you would be in regards to something Mohamed Bahi said. He was the Algerian leader, nonprofit organizer in the film. And it was early on, it struck me because he said Trump was nothing new. Trump was not new. It was the same thing that had been preached since 9/11, right? Muslim communities had been facing this sort of discrimination from that point, but certainly from earlier on. And so Mohammed, he spoke about having allies, right? And we saw a few allies in this film. He talked about his Latinx and his Asian neighbors, fellow immigrants, new to New York, going through the same experience. And then I think outside the religious center there at NYU, we see Jewish folks showing up, right, to show their support. And so I'm curious if we want to talk about how it is our communities, especially since Chicago Theological Seminary represents a very interfaith base, how it is other religious communities can show up and really support our Muslim brothers and sisters in the continued work that needs to be done.
Well, if I can just share that a lot of what I encountered was sort of new to me on a number of levels. And that is to say, I was surprised, and of course pleasantly surprised, but the extent of Muslim-Jewish, Muslim-Christian alliance that was going on, I can't say that I was up to speed on before I started finding it every demonstration I went to. And this is work that the groundwork had been laid for, and Dr. Debbie can speak about this much more eloquently than I can, for quite some time. And, as my grandmother would say, in terrible times, good things happen. And as from my perspective, one of the good things that happened as a reaction and response to the Trump reign of terror was people working together in an even increased way and trying to share alliance in a way that was, really substantive and hopefully fruitful for all. And when I heard about Congregation Beit Simchat Torah, which is the Jewish congregation that was going down to the Islamic Center at NYU, which is a remarkable place, and we're standing in solidarity, a certain part of me was a bit, I would say a little bit cynical. I said, come on, it's ICNYU, the most progressive Muslim entity one can imagine, in Greenwich Village, in New York City. I mean, all efforts are good. Is that support really, necessary at that place? And I would say that I was wrong. It is very necessary, and that the people who were coming to the Friday afternoon prayers, they would like stop and just thank from the bottom of their hearts the folks from CBST. You came there for 1 year, for 2 years in the snow every Friday, and I think that really is the seed on one level of interfaith alliance that takes many, many forms. Imam Latif of ICNYU is an amazing man. I know he's been to CBST. My own synagogue here in New York has had Muslim folks, both from my film and from other places, and vice versa. And on the political level, as well as on the religious level, not to separate them, but I think it happens on many levels, that kind of interaction and interfaith connection is a really fertile area. And as to how it takes form politically is a little bit beyond my expertise, but as to how it takes place in terms of people's lives and the connection that people feel, I've witnessed that, and I witness that all the time now. And I just think it's a tremendous thing that can only lead to good in this world.
I would say that, showing up for one another is actually a social responsibility of all of us, right? Not just, the Christian and Jewish community and other communities showing up for the Muslim community, but making sure that we all show up for one another. And one of the things that's happened in New York City, especially after, September 11th, a lot of coalitions formed that I've been a part of. I work closely with interfaith coalitions and what have you, that whenever there was anything that happened, we immediately all showed up for one another. So for example, just in more recent years, when, the Pittsburgh shooting took place, at the shul, many American Muslims actually went to Beit Simchat Torah and showed up for their service shortly following that, and standing outside in solidarity, and bringing flowers and making sure that the community felt safe and loved and connected with. Whenever there has been any tragedy, certain community members just say, we have to do a visual. And we've been able to do that. And again, it's because we're finally understanding that the only way that we can protect one another is when we show up for one another. And so, I think that we've experienced so much tragedy, both, locally, nationally, and internationally, that people, are able to come together. And, with the internet and being able to immediately, organize and publicize something, I've seen us, in New York City, do things overnight and turn out 1,000 people for a visual. And so it's really, really incredible just to see the level of commitment that people have to show up for one another. And this is something that I think we have to continue to nurture. And if there are communities that are not as engaged, helping expose them to what other people are doing in other cities, I think is really critical.
I'll just say, looking at the composition of the Senate currently, apparently 41 million more people are represented by the Democratic members of Congress, of the Senate, than the Republican or Independent. So, that seems like a substantial amount. Yet it took so much of solidarity and coalition building to barely eke out an election win, which was obviously contested falsely. And so many groups were part of that. Obviously, Stacey Abrams and all the people in the African American community who turned up, despite historically suffering at the hands of administration after administration who did not do much to improve the lot of our Black community members. Nevertheless, they had a vision, a hope, a desire, an aspiration that eventually change would come. And other groups, also immigrant groups of various backgrounds, Latinos, Asian Americans, all had to come together. Muslims, there were, 110 Muslim candidates in local elections around the country. Almost 60 of them, I believe, won their seats in school boards or, at other levels. But, it became very important that local politics was going to be an important key to demonstrate this kind of solidarity and then, make change from the ground up. I think Muslims have appreciated that process more and more as there's been more mobilization within the American Muslim community to get civically engaged and involved. So I think that, we have to continue to build these kinds of relationships. And as Dr. Debbie said, it's not just about us, whoever we consider to be our immediate tribe, but it's about all of us so that we can exert the necessary power to change the systemic injustices that are in place.
Well, this seems relevant then. I didn't see a specific question, but it was raised by several of our audience members in the chat, as well as by you, Munir, in terms of this film is called American Muslim. And what did you say? Something like 30% of Muslims in America are Black. And we're living in an era of Black Lives Matter and a very real struggle for justice. So I'm curious whether you see intersections in your work with the Black Muslims within your communities. and yeah, what it is can be done to really support them in these present day realities.
Just real quickly, I could just say, Bayan Islamic Graduate School, by student demographics, is majority Black, which wasn't the case 5 years ago, but it's part of our own evolution as an institution and our recognition of the need to do more to uplift those who've been underserved and underprivileged for so long. So I'm not trying to give us a pat on the back. We're still very much in the infancy of rectifying historic injustices. But as an American Muslim community that's grappling with intra-cultural challenges, intra-religious challenges, there is a growing discourse and a recognition that for too long our communities have operated, in distinct silos, and we need to do more internal solidarity work as well.
Yeah. I would say that I really appreciate the work that you're doing at Bayan because it's so important. Being someone who, in the last 4 years experienced the Muslim ban and everything that came with it, shortly, within hours of the Muslim ban executive order being signed and the mobilizing and organizing that took place that day by groups, not necessarily from within my own community, the Yemeni community, which was directly impacted, or the Syrian community, or the Libyan community, or the Somali community, but the larger Muslim American community and organizers across the country. Everybody rose to the occasion to mobilize and organize. And one thing that ended up happening, and this is not a criticism, but this is really more important for us to reflect on movements when we're involved in this kind of work. What ended up happening was the very directly impacted people became only seen through the prism of victimhood. And I remember getting call after call asking for people to do interviews, to share their story. But yet the spokespeople on the Muslim ban were everybody but the directly impacted people. And so one of the things that I had to do was start having those conversations with fellow organizers of saying to them, look, I love you, I appreciate you, thank you for what you're doing, but this needs to be led by directly impacted communities. I know organizers in my community, I know organizers in the Libyan community, the Syrian community, the Somali community. Let's all come to the table, and we want you to hear what our needs are and how should we proceed with mobilizing and organizing. It took a little time to do it, but it got done. Now, the reason I'm giving this example is because we've seen a lot of this happening, right? Throughout, the decades of what is happening to African Americans, to the Black community. And we really need to do a self-check. And that self-check means that we have to center the Black community and hear what their needs are, what they want, how should we proceed, what role should we play as allies, how much of a role should we be playing. And this has really been something that I've been pushing a lot in the work that I'm doing as an organizer, within just what we've seen happen, after the brutal murder of George Floyd, and helping people understand, like, we need to hear from the Black community what they want us to do, how they want us to proceed, how can we amplify their voice. And this is really, like, right now should be the focus of everything that we do, and not allow other movements to malign the movement, right? Because what we saw during the George Floyd moment, there were people who were sabotaging it with the riots and the looting, and really, hijacking the narrative of what was actually coming about. And so, what's unfortunate, as I look back right now, like, it's quiet now, but it shouldn't be quiet. This work needs to continue. And so I feel like, in venues like this and people that are on watching this, that conversation has to happen, because the only way for us to see Islamophobia ending, homophobia, xenophobia, any kind of phobia to end is that we have to address the root, cause of racism. When we eradicate racism, we will eradicate all of the other isms that exist, because it's at the root. And we know that, the one supreme entity that is basically fueling this is white supremacy. And so when we challenge it and we, bring it down, then we can all see each other in our own image.
What a powerful message. I appreciate those reflections. And I think it's related to this question I got from the chat in regards to organizing. And maybe this is for you, Adam. Can you speak to the use of arts as a catalyst for change, as a catalyst, for change and for advocacy?
When I began this film, I wasn't necessarily setting out even to make a film. I mean, I'm a filmmaker. I like telling stories. I feel I have a connection to that. I really feel drawn towards that. And what was happening, even before the Muslim ban, what was happening with the target of another religious minority in this country, I just felt I needed to do something. And I didn't necessarily mean that that had to be a feature documentary. I honestly thought that if I could remove my ego from that as someone that makes feature documentaries and perhaps just make some short films for the web, perhaps make an advocacy film for a Muslim nonprofit that would help them, which I actually did along the way out of some footage I was shooting. I really just wanted to make a contribution. I really did. And let me be very clear, as a no longer outside, but as an ally, I wasn't setting out to speak for other people. I wasn't trying to save the Muslim community or speak for the Muslim community. They were very capable of speaking for themselves. And I'm pretty sensitive to doing that. I have no right or no credibility to do that. I'm not interested in it. I was really trying to give voice to stories that are out there. Once it became clear there was really a very rich and important and multi-layered story that had to be told here, it's really this phase of the film that is most interesting to me. I mean, I love telling the stories. I love trying to construct it and make it happen. But I'm really committed to what I call the outreach phase, which as a filmmaker is something I've come to over time. At first, I don't think I even knew what that word meant. It was more kind of a line of rhetoric you would use in grant proposals that it'll have outreach. And in fact, on the community level, even more than in the film world in which I live, which might be film festivals, it might be on HBO, Sundance Film Festival, things like that, which are very celebrated and get you a lot of attention. I make films for this. I make films for this kind of interaction. And this may be a little more, like intellectual sometimes than happens with other kinds of faith communities, but whatever it is, I'm trying to put forth a story that'll get people talking to each other. And perhaps, I mean, in this film, I was trying to put forth a story that for communities of people I knew, whether they were Jewish or not, but non-Muslim people, could have a little window into a world they didn't know about and hopefully learn a little bit more. And sometimes people say, humanizing people, which is an awkward word to come out of my mouth because nobody needs to be humanized. By definition, we're all humans. But I do think, not a lot of people have been inside an Indonesian home before or at an Indonesian wedding. And that's what I meant, that it's two things. One is to tell the political story and to give voice to this piece of history that will hopefully become history in the past tense, but also just into worlds of communities that some of us and some of my peers don't know well enough, like in Ozone Park, which is different culturally and socioeconomically in a way that I don't have that much access to, So that's what I mean. It was a gift to be able to be let into it and to earn some kind of trust to be there. So I don't have a mission and an advocacy per se, except to share the story and to allow that to kind of plant seeds that'll continue growing and to try to facilitate in every way that I can. And here in COVID, when people can't really get together anymore in the kind of ways that I really care about deeply, to be able to Zooming with communities that I hear that I probably wouldn't have been going to, and Chicago is pretty easy. I'm talking about some, more far-flung places, is actually an interesting opportunity in the Zoom era to kind of get this word out and to allow those communities to do what they will with it. And hopefully, I'm usually a part of, I'm exposed to a short period of 45 minutes or an hour of conversation. And maybe we'd go out afterwards for dinner and talk a little bit further. But after that, I leave. And my fervent hope is that the film, the story, the dialogue, as it impacts that community, will continue. So to me, that's the arts and having a resonance and, letting the waters continue to ripple.
Thank you, Adam. Yeah, and as the audience is saying, you certainly did open that window or that door for us into people's homes, into people's communities, and we got to see the side of America that perhaps is not shown in the media nearly enough. And I'm curious, I don't know if Debbie or Munir would have had a response to that question, but whether arts do play a role in your advocacy work and your push for change.
Absolutely. Arts does play a very critical role, for the work that I do in terms of organizing. There is a term called art activism. It's something that you identify things that you can basically amplify, through art, whether it's the posters that you are presenting, or the prompts that you are using to visualize. And some of those examples, and I'm sure some of you might have seen this on social media, in one of the rallies, there was a gentleman who actually took his doormat that said, welcome, and was holding it as a sign, and it just went viral. Literally a doormat that had the word welcome carved in it, and it just went viral, right? This is how you disrupt, you disrupt the narrative, that you bring something unique and fascinating, to a movement. And it was just such a powerful thing, as something as simple as that, holding that up, something that we all have in our doorstep, to welcome people into our own home, was his message that, we welcome you to this house. So, finding ways and opportunities to do that, through all of our, the chants and singing and dancing, have been things that we've actually done as well in some of our organizing.
I would just say that, academia and art have an interesting connection, an interesting commonality. Both, I would say, both modalities enable us to problematize and show complexity in life. We go to grad school because some of the narratives that we may have received, are serviceable for a day-to-day living, but really don't give us a bigger picture or help us understand that things are more complicated than they might be presented. And I think art does the same thing in a different way, and gives us an emotional avenue through which to explore the themes of life. And so I think it's extremely important. We obviously want to encourage students in the context of our work, encourage students that, whether it's intellectual work or whether it's service to others or whether it's expression through music or other forms of art, all of these things are important experiences that should be part and parcel. And it's not one or the other, but we have to find a way for ourselves to integrate these dimensions of life.
Well, thank you for that. And I certainly agree that our role, perhaps as educators and as, everyday people, is to truly complicate that story and share it in whatever form that it's going to be best received, right? So thank you to all of you. Before I move to close, I think, Adam, was there something you wanted to share with the audience?
Well, to jump ahead to my own personal closing, I'm really glad to be here. And I really relish being in opportunities where I can learn much more than I know, which is I'm having today. So I'm glad to be more of a listener than a speaker. But I just did want to say, just as Kim Schultz and Chicago Theological Seminary kind of really embraced the notion of this, using the film as a vehicle for discussion, I'm really open to that in different venues, and I'm doing that all over. If anyone's interested, you should definitely get in touch with me. The film is available is on Canopy, which is available in many library systems for viewing. It is, if any other information about it is available on my website, AmericanMuslimFilm.com, and both ways to see the film, as well as, to interact with things like that, as well as links to my other projects. So thank you for posting that in the chat, and that's all I wanted to say.
Great. Well, thank you to all of our panelists. Please join me in giving them a round of applause, virtual or real on camera, or both. And on behalf of the Interreligious Institute at Chicago Theological Seminary and Bayan School, thank you to everyone for your commitment to really seeing inside the American Muslim story and sharing in this very meaningful conversation. Let us all go forward to organize, to advocate, and really take care of our neighbors. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.